other colleagues, and I want to start with the University of Adelaide. Professor Hoy, congratulations on your appointment as the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Adelaide. I read with some interest your interview with David Penberthy in The Australian on the 3rd of February to coincide with your appointment as Vice-Chancellor, and the article was entitled, "I've learnt a lesson on China." So I'd be interested if you could share with the committee what the lessons you have learned on China.
So, first of all, thank you very much, Chair. I should say that I'm appearing here, of course, in my capacity as Vice-Chancellor and President of Adelaide. And if at all possible, I would, of course, like to discuss University of Adelaide matters. In relationship to the other matter you are raising, you will probably know that the matter you're referring to is in association with interviews that were happening about matters taking place at the University of Queensland. I do note that University of Queensland is coming on later, so I will confine my comments to things that relate to me as a person. The interview that I gave David Penberthy is an interview of which we have a strong record, and I stand by the comments in the body of the text, which are in quotation marks. I do not recall having made the comment that forms the subject of the headline. The lessons that I think many of us have learned is that there has been a shift of the ground geopolitically, and that the world has changed, and that we as a university understand the purpose of this inquiry, and we're looking forward to collaborating fully with your committee to achieve the objectives of contributing to Australia's national security and broader interests.
What have you learned, though, about being a senior administrator of a university and the relationship between universities and China and how they need to be managed?
What I have learned during my 14 years as Vice-Chancellor of University of South Australia, Queensland, and now Adelaide is, as I've said before, that the ground has shifted. There was previously strong optimism that the powers in the world could collaborate to further prosperity for the benefit of the entire global population. Many of us have Confucius institutes, and the one at the University of Adelaide was opened in 2007 by former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. We had a paper from the Australian government about Australia in the 18th century, and all the activities, I can certainly speak for myself, that we undertook under my leadership in 3 universities were always designed to serve the Australian national interest best. We now hear through various communications, the detail of which we always not privy to from security agencies under the control of the national government, that the ground has shifted, that the optimism about sharing for the benefit of all is not as great anymore, and we have to change accordingly. I do believe that Australian universities have had the great privilege of working strongly with the government, for instance, through UFIT, to increase our security posture.
I agree with you, Professor Hoy, that the ground has shifted in some respects, but some things haven't changed. And in your own words, and in that same article, and I quote, when asked about the Chinese government directly funding 4 courses at the University of Queensland, under your oversight as Vice-Chancellor, we totally deny that the Confucius Institutes were involved in the formulation of courses. However, it should never have happened. When you run a university, there are lots of things happening in an institution with 6,000 people, most of whom are independent thinkers. As soon as we learnt about it, we said, never again, it was a stupid thing to do. So that's not an instance, I gather, in your view, of the ground having shifted or geopolitics having changed. It's never appropriate for an authoritarian foreign government to fund courses at an Australian university, is it?
I agree with that statement, and that's why I made it. And whilst you would like to think that as the leader of an organisation with about 18,000 people on the payroll and 55,000 students, that you would be knowledgeable of everything that happens in your institution, from time to time things happen which are not wise, and that was definitely something that shouldn't have happened at the University of Queensland.
How, in your experience leading large universities, how does something like that get through the internal processes of a university? Who signs off on that? What level of oversight is required for a decision like that? Presumably it wasn't just a single individual or employee who agreed to that arrangement.
There are policies and procedures for how things should be signed off, and I'm not exactly sure how this decision to allocate a small amount of funding for a school to be able to develop a course, how that was taken. I'm not even sure that if you looked at the policies and procedures that an occasion like that was foreshadowed, and therefore that it was stated clearly that something like that shouldn't happen. With the benefit of hindsight, it is clear that that shouldn't have happened.
So what did happen when you discovered it? What action did you take as Vice-Chancellor?
As Vice-Chancellor, I first of all made it very clear that I was very disappointed in this having happened, and that it couldn't happen in the future. And that was communicated very clearly.
What happened to the courses?
I'm not across that detail. You would have to ask University of Queensland what the current status of University of Queensland courses are.
Who did you communicate your disappointment to?
I believe it was the director of the Confucius Institute.
Right. The director of the Confucius Institute was a university employee?
Yes.
Chosen by the university?
Yes. Long-standing employee.
Right. Why was a Confucius Institute funded by the foreign government making decisions about courses offered in an academic context? I had always understood from evidence that other universities have given to this committee and elsewhere that Confucius Institutes are not supposed to be involved in the delivery of academic courses.
The University of Queensland, and again, I do encourage you to explore these issues with the University of Queensland. I've been out of the job for more than half a year now, but it's my understanding that the courses were chosen by schools through normal academic procedures as being important to mount. And it was suggested to the schools, wrongly in my view, that perhaps they could ask the Confucius Institute for some support to develop the courses. It is my clear understanding that these courses were not suggested by the Confucius Institute. They reacted to a request for funding, and they were not involved in the development of the courses nor the delivery of those courses.
So if it was the case that the Confucius Institute director just approved and facilitated the payment, and it was in fact academic employees in the university who were requesting funds, going back to your earlier answer that you weren't sure whether there was policies or procedures for that envisage these sorts of events, why shouldn't have there been policies and procedures in place that prevented that from even being asked for, let alone granted?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand your question.
Why didn't the University of Queensland have in place policies which would prevent these sorts of funding arrangements being asked for and entered into?
So first of all, there are lots of policies at a university. I'm not saying that there wasn't a policy in place. I'm saying that I cannot state categorically that there was. It is clear that in future, one would formulate one's policies through a new lens, a lens that is cognizant of today's world and not the world as we saw it more than a decade
But sorry,
ago.
Professor Hoy, as you yourself conceded at the beginning of this conversation, nothing about the changed geopolitical environment makes it less acceptable to have a foreign authoritarian government funding courses in an Australian university. You yourself said that should never have happened under any geopolitical context. So my question is why, it surprises me, given that you said you were so shocked by this, that you were so concerned by this, that you're not able to say who made the decision, that you're not able to say that there was a policy against it.
Well, I'm not able to say that there was a policy against that exact occurrence. I wish there had been, but I think there should be, but I can't tell you that there was at that particular point in time.
Okay. Turning more broadly to Confucius Institutes at universities, at UQ in 2019, the agreement between the University of Queensland and Handban, I believe, was renegotiated out of a recognition that the previous agreement contained insufficient protections for the university's autonomy and academic freedom. Why, in any geopolitical context, was an agreement struck with a foreign government that didn't have protections for academic freedom and institutional autonomy?
I can't answer that question. It happened in 2009, prior to my coming into position. I assume that it relates to what we talked about before, that the world was different some 12 years ago, and I think that is evidenced, as I said before, by a Confucius Institute also being opened by former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer.
Professor Hoy, in what world was it appropriate, in what geopolitical environment was it appropriate for a university to agree with a foreign authoritarian government an arrangement to fund an institution on campus that does not protect the university's autonomy or academic freedom? I would have thought that those were timeless values of universities.
I did not say it was appropriate. You asked me, how did that come to be? And I said to you, I did not work at the university at that time, so I can't answer that question.
Okay. Why did you resign as a consultant to Handban?
I did not resign as a consultant for Handban. I resigned as a council member of Handban.
Okay. And why did you resign as a council member to Handban?
For two reasons. One was that my job was so busy, I felt that I couldn't attend the meetings that I was expected to attend. And the other reason is that the FITS bill came into existence, and I have been a former principal executive officer in the Australian government, reporting both to Brendan Nelson and Julie Bishop when they were education ministers. And as you will be aware, Senator, when you have held those positions, you need for a period of 10 years, or maybe it's 15 years, I can't remember, to always register yourself on the FITS register if you have any interaction with the foreign entity.
That's interesting because a number of your peers in running other universities contend that Confucius Institutes raise no issues with the foreign influence transparency scheme and don't require registration. Did you come to a different view that your involvement with Handban required registration if you had remained on it?
No, I came to the view that because I was in the special situation of being a designated person under the legislation that I had to register on the register, irrespective of whether we were talking about a Confucius Institute or I assume a Hoover Institute in the US. It is simply a consequence of the legislation, not a consequence of the activities of a particular organisation.
Right, so you haven't come to the view that it was not appropriate as a senior leader of a university to be serving on a body founded and run by a foreign authoritarian state?
When I first was given the opportunity to be a consultant to Hanban, I wrote to Foreign Minister Julie Bishop in 2013 and informed her of this matter. And I got a letter back from the China division from DFAT, which was not discouraging at all. As I've said, both sides of government saw the world through a different lens. And we, as senior officials in universities, always tried to pursue the national interest and be aligned with government directions.
Okay, so if not for Fitz and your busy diary, you would happily serve as a consultant or an advisor to Hanban today?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I didn't get that.
If it was not for your very busy diary and the Fitz legislation, you'd be happy to remain involved with Hanban today?
I would have to evaluate that in light of the changed geopolitical settings now.
Okay, thank you.
I would only do so if it were deemed in the national interest to do so. Previously, when I wrote to the foreign minister, the view was that it is better to have a seat at the table than not being there. In this case, it was not a matter, in my view, of me being influenced by a foreign entity. It was a matter of me being at the table so I could influence a foreign entity to do the right thing by the countries in which they sought to have Confucius Institutes.
Okay, I have one final question, one final issue to pursue with you, and then I'll offer the call to other committee members, particularly a Labor colleague on the committee who would like to seek the call. Professor Hoy, what are your reflections on the University of Queensland handling of the Drew Pavlou matter?
Senator Paterson, sorry, you're not a senator, Chair Paterson.
I'm a senator, that's okay. That's all right.
Oh, you are Senator, of course you are. Senator Paterson, you will be aware that the University of Queensland has written to the committee and reminded it that the Pavlou matter is a matter which currently is in front of the Supreme Court in Queensland. And there are substantial pleadings lodged there. And you will also be aware of the sub judice conventions that parliamentary inquiries make reference to. I think it would be unwise for the committee to draw conclusions about some of those elements without reference to the full pleadings in the Supreme Court. I can say to you that I was not involved at all in the allegations that were presented to Mr. Pavlou, nor in the conduct of the various inquiries. And I believe that it would be better addressed with the University of Queensland. What I can say is, of course, from having read the pleadings to the Supreme Court, I am aware of the University of Queensland's views on this matter, and they have written to certainly the committee chaired by Abetz earlier that the allegations made against the University of Queensland and others, including myself, were variously inaccurate, incomplete, or invented.
Professor Hoy, the Pavlou affair has done profound reputational damage to the University of Queensland, not just in Australia, around the globe. It's attracted enormous media coverage and controversy. Is it seriously your evidence that you had no involvement in that matter? And isn't that a failure as Vice-Chancellor not to be involved in such an important matter concerning your university?
It is seriously my position, as stated by the university, that I had no involvement. I think it is appropriate that I had no involvement because we have policies and procedures at University of Queensland which prescribe how these matters should proceed, much as I assume that a state premier wouldn't get involved in a matter before the courts in their state. I had no role in those matters because it was not open to me to have a role in those matters. The university is, of course, subject to many regulations, including the TEXA regulations, and there are things it must do under various circumstances. But I do believe, given that I had no involvement, that it would be better for you to explore that matter with the University of Queensland.
Looking back, do you have any regrets at all about how the university handled that matter?
As I wasn't involved, it's very hard for me to answer that question. I think it has to be asked of the University of Queensland. I do, of course, regret that University of Queensland and Mr. Pavlou, in the view of some, are so orthogonal in their views, because I would have thought that it's clear to all that both the university and Mr. Pavlou believe that any violation of human rights, etc., is wrong.
Professor Hoy, a student at your university was assaulted. He subsequently received thousands of death threats directed at him and his family, threats of rape of his mother and murder and other horrible, horrible things. He was dragged through the mud and then suspended from the university, severely disrupting his studies. And a message has been sent to students on that campus that it's unwise and unsafe to speak up about the university's relationship with China or our country's relationship with China. You're seriously saying you don't have regrets about how that matter was handled by the university?
I am not privy to all the details about how that matter was handled because it was not open to me to be involved in it for the reasons that some people would. First of all, the policy framework did not allow me to be involved. Secondly, it was clear that Mr. Pavlou had lots of things to say about my character, and if I were involved, people would say that I would have a very, very strong conflict of interest and shouldn't be involved.
Okay, well, Professor, I think that, I have to say, I think that doesn't reflect all that well, that you, just because you weren't privy to the processes and the details and how it was exactly handled. I mean, we all saw it in the media, we all read the newspapers. I don't think anyone watching that was unmoved by that. I'm surprised that you don't have any personal reflections on that.
Well, I do have personal reflections on it.
You're just not willing to share them?
No, I have shared them with you. I accept that it is absolutely my view that Mr. Pavlou very strongly believes in the need to stand up for what he believes in. And it is absolutely my view, as stated very clearly by University of Queensland publicly that this was never a matter of curtailing people's right to protest lawfully and to exercise their freedom of speech.
Sadly, I think the UQ is the only person who, in the institution that feels that way, believes that. Deputy Chair.